more than 10 million people will die of tuberculosis in the next 10 years. Because AIDS, this deadly disease, is desperately needed, my partner and I stand resolved. The United States federal government should substantially reform its foreign aid. Now, before we get into why we need to increase funding for this disease or how much to increase it by, it's crucial that we take a look at a background point to provide clarity throughout this round. Now, the background point can be tagged as tuberculosis aid. Again, a background point, tuberculosis aid. And subpoint A under here, to provide some context, can be tagged as leading cause of death. In subpoint A, leading cause of death. So here I'll be explaining what tuberculosis is and how deadly it is in the world so far. So the Henry J. Kaiser Family Foundation and KFF, right in 2018, they see tuberculosis, an infectious disease caused by bacteria, is a leading cause of death worldwide. Despite being preventable and curable, about 10 million people develop active TB every single year, which can be spread to others. TB is found all over the world, but the majority of TB cases are concentrated in developing countries. So here in the US, we have a TB vaccine. It's perfectly curable. We basically eradicated tuberculosis because we have the funds. In developing countries where they're much poorer, they can't afford to do so themselves, so we give foreign aid to help them get rid of this disease. That can be seen in subpoint B of US aid programs. Subpoint B, US aid programs. This is from the same source above in 2018. They say US TB activities reach more than 50 countries and focus on preventing, detecting, and treating TB, including drug-resistant TB, as well as funding research and development. So just for clarification, US funding for bilateral TB efforts through our US aid agency was $260 million in 2018, up from about $60 million when we first started. So as of right now, we give about $260 million a year towards fighting this disease in about 50 countries. Now, subpoint C into the background point and the final point can be tagged as programs are successful. Again, subpoint C, programs are successful. This is from the USAID website in February 2019. They say since 2000, the USAID TB program has achieved a nearly 50% reduction in TB-related deaths, and with our partners, we've saved more than 54 million lives. Again, our current programs, the current funding we're giving, with the current spending patterns, has already saved 54 million lives. It's very successful, it just needs more funding. This is because this disease is unfortunately still the leading cause of death, and 10 million people are still being infected every single year. Now I'll present two justifications as to why we need to increase funding. Justification 1 can be written down as TB is still prevalent. Again, justification 1, TB is still prevalent. And subpoint A can be tagged as progress has stalled. Again, subpoint A, progress has stalled. This is from Advancing TB Vaccines for the World in 2017. They say TB remains the top infectious disease killer in the world, and progress towards ending TB has stalled. This is backed up by the International Journal of Science in 2018. They say around 25% of the world's population, almost 2 billion people, are infected with TB. The World Health Organization estimates in 2017 alone, some 10 million people fell ill with the disease, and 1.6 million died. So every year, millions of people get this disease, and millions of people die from it. The problem in the current system is only a fraction of the people who need treatment actually have it. That can be seen in subpoint B. Only 20% have treatment. Subpoint B. Only 20% have treatment. This is from the same source above in 2017. They say only 1 in 5 patients in need of treatment for TB are enrolled in it. Again, only 1 in 5. That's a 20% rate of people who actually need treatment but are being treated for it. So as long as people aren't being treated for it in other countries, their health is damaged and they will spread the disease to others because it's contagious. Therefore, the disease will actually grow exponentially. Clearly, something needs to change. That can be further seen in Justification 2, a need for funding. Justification 2, a need for funding. And to provide some background, subpoint A will be the global plan to end TB. Subpoint A, the global plan to end TB. Now the WHO is the World Health Organization and the United Nations classify TB as a global health emergency. In order to tackle TB, they created a comprehensive set of plans that aims to end the disease by 2030 or 2035. This is from TB Facts in 2018. They say in 2014, the World Health Assembly, composed of 194 countries, adopted the WHO, or the World Health Organization's 20-year strategy that aims to end the global TB epidemic, and is unsurprisingly called the End TB Strategy. Now this plan has specific targets set for the year 2030. Let's take a look at these targets. This is from Helio in September 2018. They say, since the World Health Assembly has adopted the WHO's End TB Strategy, it aims to reduce TB deaths by 90% and new cases by 80%. So that's the global plan to end TB. By 2030, we hope to reduce deaths from this disease by 90% and new cases by 80%. Unfortunately, these goals cannot currently be met because there is a substantial funding gap. There just isn't enough money. That can be proven in subpoint B of Justification 2. Subpoint B is a funding gap. And subpoint B, funding gap. Now, progress towards reaching these goals has stalled because of a lack of funding. This is from the World Health Organization's Global TB report in September 2018. They say the most urgent challenge right now is to scale up funding. In 2018, investments in TB prevention fell $3.5 billion short of what is needed for implementation and prevention. A further $1.3 billion per year is required to accelerate the development of new vaccines, diagnostics, and medicine. So there's a total of 3.5 a year for the implementation of the procedures and the treatment, and 1.3 for funding research and development to get new treatment methods out. So if we add the numbers together, 3.5 plus 1.3, there's a $4.8 billion funding gap to fund research, prevention, and ultimately achieve the targets to end the disease by 2030. However, if we don't fully fund TB prevention, the best we can do is keep the disease at bay, watch as more people die, and the international economy take a hit. This is evidence from the Friends of the Global Fight Against AIDS, TB, and Malaria in 2018. They say the TB epidemic is a global health security threat that must be brought out of the shadows. A recent report estimates failing to tackle TB will cost the world economy $1 trillion by 2030. Will cost the world economy $1 trillion. So that's the choice we have right now, even just concerning the finance. Either give $5 billion a year and solve the disease, or not give $5 billion and lose $1 trillion. Now, subpoint C, and the most important subpoint, can be tagged as closed gap equals lives saved. Subpoint C, closed gap equals lives saved. From the World Health Organization in 2016, they say if fully funded, over 90% of TB patients estimated to have TB will be detected and provided treatment. The WHO estimates if the funding gap is filled, it would enable full treatment for 17 million TB patients and save 6 million lives over just 3 years. And that's just 3 years. We'll provide the numbers for up to 2030 later on. But what we see right now is there is a funding gap, and it is clearly time for a change. This is why we present the plan. The mandate: increase U.S. funding for TB prevention and research and development to U.S. aid by $4.8 billion for the next 10 years. You can simply write down as increase TB funding to U.S. aid by $4.8 billion for the next 10 years, and U.S. aid will follow recommendations in the WHO Global Plan to end TB as they do right now. Now, the agency and enforcement for our plan is Congress, the President, and any other necessary agencies, and the timing is the start of fiscal year 2020. To get this funding, Congress will be required to appropriate $4.8 billion in the next spending bill for the next 10 years as they do with other funding. One solvency point before I end this speech, which is on getting on track to end TB. Getting on track to end TB. The Global Fund says in 2016, if the funding gap is filled, 10 million lives will be saved. 45 million people will be prevented from getting TB, and there will be an anticipated $1.2 trillion in economic investment. Right now, the TB programs have been successful, but without further funding, we cannot increase progress. By filling the gap, we save lives and save the world economy from losing $1 trillion. Thank you.
Ooh. I didn't even have to waste any cross-ex time on that one. All right. Is my timer ready?
Oh. I thought you already started. All right.
Okay. So, actually, 1AC is done. Never mind, actually. So, first of all, your plan here is to fight TB. Now, how do we do this in foreign countries?
Basically, what we do, first of all, is we give funding to research scientists, one in the WHO and in the foreign countries.
So, when we're talking about the physical disease itself, like if somebody has it, are we giving them the vaccines that we do in the United States?
Yes, we do give them vaccines. We're currently moving towards an oral kind of treatment.
Now, actually, that brings me to the next question. How close are we to developing a new vaccine?
We're currently on the preliminary stages of the new oral medicine, which will be far easier than taking vaccines, but we need more funding to completely implement it throughout all the TB.
All right, so is the vaccine created or is it still being created?
It's not a vaccine, it's an oral treatment.
Oral treatment.
Replaces vaccine.
So is it completed or is it not completed?
The creation has been completed, but we need more research and development money to implement it further and to take it out to those people who actually need it.
All right, now basically you said that the fight against tuberculosis has stalled. Now this isn't because the funding has decreased, correct? It's because the funding is stagnant?
Because it's stagnant, yes.
All right, now would we both agree here that in order to treat TB you have to find TB?
Absolutely,
right.
And that says people will be found with TB and treated.
Right, so how do we increase that detection? Like what's going to change that now we can actually find more people with TB?
Research and development, because we've developed new methods of detecting people with TB.
All right, now how close are those research development projects being finished?
The WHO report says if we fill the gap, they will be able to achieve this and detect patients.
All right, let's actually talk about the WHO. They came up with this plan. All right, now, should we both agree then that the WHO should be leading the way in trying to treat TB, is that correct?
Well, the WHO doesn't treat TB themselves. What they do is they create a set of plans for the world and tell each country where to put the money based on the studies they've done. So our agency implements the WHO's recommendations.
Okay, so we follow the WHO's plans, but we still both agree that they should be proactively trying to fix the problem or spending money.
They are, by putting reports. WHO doesn't have money of its own. It tells member countries where to put the money.
The WHO doesn't have money?
They don't have billions of dollars lying around to fight TB specifically. They're not a
If they did, should they be fighting TB?
Sure.
All right, let's talk about your plan. Now, where is the United States money going?
It's going towards, first of all, U.S. programs that we have in these countries and NGOs under the WHO.
Now, how many countries do these U.S. programs work in?
More than 50.
More than 50. All right, you've cited a lot of numbers in your case. Specifically, let's look at the $4.8 billion funding cap. What was the support for this number?
The WHO 2018 Global TB Report, endorsed by 194 countries.
Is that also the one that talks about millions of lives being saved and so on?
Yes.
Could we see that report, please?
Sure.
Okay. All right. Well, that was the last one, actually, so. Thank you. Ooh, okay. Further questions?
I'm going to start this first negative constructive by giving you an observation. You can just write this down as the affirmative burden. Now, I want to clarify for you exactly what the affirmative team needs to do in order to warrant your ballot today. Now, this includes things like the stock issues, which they need to prove first that they are under the resolution or that they are topical, which don't worry, we're not running topical. Secondly, however, they need to prove that they're not inherent, that the problems within the status quo are being solved themselves. Thirdly, they need to prove a significant problem within the status quo, a quantifiable problem, and lastly, they need to prove quantifiable solvency, or basically this idea that by passing the affirmative team's plan, by funding these recommendations from the World Health Organization, we will quantifiably eradicate TB, as their own evidence stated by, I believe it was a reduction of 90% in mortality, then 80% in new cases. And until they can prove that to us quantifiably, they will not be warranting your ballot. Now let's move on to a negative philosophy. You can simply write the negative philosophy down as no proven advancement. Again, no proven advancement. It's important to recognize that the affirmative team will be addressing this more specifically with evidence later when we talk about their points, but when we examine the World Health Organization's plan and recommendations, while it's great that the United States might be able to do something slightly more with this money, it's not accurately reflected in this idea that we can end TB simply from the United States throwing more cash at the problem, because there are systemic problems and there are problems that need to be addressed by the general world community as a whole, not just the United States. With this in mind, I now want to give you a criterion or what today's weighing mechanism should be based on. You can simply write this down as provable effect. Again, provable effect. Ultimately, whatever team best proves there will be a provable effect by the World Health Organization plan or won't be a provable effect by the World Health Organization plan is the one that you should be voting for in today's debate round. With this in mind, we'd like to now move on to their points, looking at their justifications. Now, both of their justifications are talking about this idea that TB is still prevalent, that our progress is stalled, that we've lacked the ability to treat people, and that we need to start funding more. Since they were both kind of on the same line, and we responded to them both with some solvency. The first solvency point you can write down is that of the wrong approach. Again, solvency 1, wrong approach. Subpoint A under this is that WHO uses vaccines. Again, WHO uses vaccines. From UNICEF on 2015, quote, the BCG vaccine is used against tuberculosis. The World Health Organization recommends that BCG be given to all children living in highly endemic countries as well as infants and children at particular risk of TB exposure. But what's wrong with this? Subpoint B is that BCG is unsuccessful. Again, BCG is unsuccessful. This type of vaccine that the World Health Organization recommends is unsuccessful. The National Center for Biotechnology Information in 2009, quote, considering that natural TB infection does not protect against exogenous reinfection and disease, however, mimicking natural infection using attenuated strains or cocktails of naturally interferon gamma introducing antigens might not necessarily be the most promising vaccine strategy. Indeed, the largely unsuccessful implementation of the BCG vaccine might serve as a warning, end quote. Now that was a lot of scientific gobbledygook, so allow me to explain it in common man terms. See, what this is saying is that this vaccine is unuseful in actually preventing tuberculosis because the way vaccines work is basically you're sending an inert version of the virus or what have you into the body. However, because TB, natural TB resistance doesn't effectively exist, this vaccine doesn't have significant impact as given by the evidence. Now, this is a problem because this is one of the World Health Organization's recommendations. One of the things that the affirmative team is effectively going to be funding in United States aid programs. What we see is that this is unsuccessful at actually affecting TB, therefore they cannot prove that they will actually create this 90% decrease in mortality or an 80% decrease in active cases. But solvency point 2 is that of not eradicable. Again, solvency point 2, not eradicable. From Max Roser in October 2018, quote, "The three most lethal infectious diseases, tuberculosis, HIV and AIDS, and malaria are currently considered not eradicable because we do not have the means against them which would be effective enough," end quote. Now, this sounds like it might be an argument for the affirmative team that we need to create more effective methods. So allow me to explain in the next couple of areas how they will not be creating a more effective method. The first point under this is that they must develop a new vaccine. Again, we must develop a new vaccine. Now, this is important because as was clarified in cross-examination, what is specifically being researched by the World Health Organization right now is an oral drug, not a new vaccine. From the National Center for Biotechnological Information in 2009, quote, "Developing a universal effective vaccine might be the only way to eliminate TB in the future. This is particularly true given the large reservoir of latently infected individuals in the world, which would be impossible to eliminate through a prophylactic drug treatment," end quote. What we see here is that the affirmative team wants to go with this WHO recommendation that creates a new drug, but the evidence says that a new drug is not going to work. What we need is a new vaccine. But let's now look at the second area, which is that of unknown cases. Again, unknown cases. From the Global Fund in 2019, quote, "TB is spread from person to person through coughing and sneezing. Roughly 36% of people with active TB are missed each year," end quote. Now, what we see from this is that a large percentage of people who actually have tuberculosis are missed every year. The affirmative team wants to tell you that by voting affirmative, they increase detection. However, if you actually examine the WHO study, it actually says, quote, "Underreported of detected TB cases. In many countries, levels of unreporting may be high. This is especially the case for those countries that lack policies on mandatory notification and other measures," end quote. Now, this is important because it's talking about the domestic countries' policies, not the American governmental aid. What this means is that detection is not going to increase because it's a systemic problem with the country's governments and their lack of policies that basically affect increasing. It doesn't matter how much cash the United States throws at the issue, detection is not going to increase because the local countries don't change their policies. However, let's now move on to another solvency point. You can write this down as inaccurate tests. Again, inaccurate tests. Now, this specifically addresses the idea that we're funding TB research to have better tuberculosis infection. From the National Center for Biotechnological Information, 2009, quote, "Advances in TB research are hampered by the fact that MTBC is a biosafety level 3 pathogen with a long generation time, making it slow and complex to culture." And then it goes on to list several more factors, but it says that all these factors complicate and prolong the development of new interventions and their assessment in clinical trials. One of the problems that has been that the macrophage and mouse infection models used in these studies relied on poorly characterized strains, and finding irrelevant links to human disease has been all but impossible, end quote. What does this mean? This means that the way that TB is actually researched is researched in such a way that it's almost ineffective comparing it to an actual human being. Now, when we talk about this, it's important to recognize because one of the benefits of the affirmative team's plan is that supposedly we're going to research these new effects, they're going to come out, and then we'll be able to solve TB. However, what we see is that the way we actually research TB right now prevents us from doing that because it's inaccurate. However, let's now move on to the last solvency point, which you can write down as drug resistance. Again, drug resistance. From the Global Fund in 2019, quote, "Standard TB treatments require up to 6 months of drugs that can cause nausea, vomiting, and stomach pain. The duration and side effects drive some people to abandon their treatment, which can lead to drug resistance. When TB bacteria is resistant to at least one of the main TB drugs, in 2017 there were 558,000 new cases with resistance to this effective first-line drug, of which 82% had multi-drug resistance TB," end quote. What does this mean? This means that because of the way TB medication works right now, it's very uncomfortable for the people taking it, which means that they go off the medication, which means that the TB in them becomes drug resistant. Now, this is important because their plan says that we're going to create a new drug. However, they haven't proven that this new drug is less painful, which means that the exact same thing will most likely happen. However, let's now look at their solvency point because we've addressed the other justifications of getting on track to end TB. You can tag my response as no proven effect. Again, no proven effect. They haven't given us a quantifiable thing. We see the World Health Organization says fund this recommendation and it will happen, but the recommendations are inherently flawed for all the solvency reasons I brought up to you in this speech. For this reason, the affirmative team has failed their burden to prove they will reduce mortality by 90% and active cases by 80%. Thank you.
You ended your speech by saying the recommendations were flawed because of the solvency points presented by these external scientists, correct?
Yes.
So is it your contention that the World Health Organization and the 194 experts that made this study weren't aware of these solvency points you brought up?
That's your burden to prove that they were aware of these solvency points.
So, logically, what do you think they just ignore the fact that there's resistance or people don't take treatment?
It's the okay. You have to recognize that when one scientist does research, it's not like they go out and they research every other possible candidate or response to their research. It's your burden to prove, because the World Health Organization is your plan, your solvency, that they were aware of these things and that they took them into account.
Okay, now let's take your solvency 1, which is the wrong approach, and they recommend the wrong vaccines, correct?
Yes.
Now, do we have tuberculosis in the United States?
I'm not so sure on that.
Okay, now do we have a tuberculosis vaccine that we use in the United States?
Yes.
And would you agree no one's getting tuberculosis and the vaccine is effective in the United States?
Right, but what we're talking about is specifically what the World Health Organization recommends.
But then you would agree there is a vaccine that can cure tuberculosis in the United States?
I need to see some statistics on that, because as I brought up later on, there's a need for a new vaccine.
Okay, but
in the solvency.
Okay, now you would agree by funding research and development, we can accelerate the response to getting a new vaccine.
Well, that was the solvency point that I brought up later, which is the idea that the way we test tuberculosis and we research it is inherently flawed.
Okay, now let's take a look at solvency point 3, which is unknown cases, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree, again, by funding research and development, we can increase the monitoring of people and fund the local health systems as well, which would help with this solvency point.
No, first of all, you need to be able to prove that. And second of all, the argumentation in your evidence actually says that it's the country's local policies, not the technology that is used.
And is your contention that we don't fund the country's local policies and just fund our own policies?
No. Allow me to explain. So when it says policy in here, it's not talking about the way that they address tuberculosis. It's specifically talking about the country's institutional policies or laws around tuberculosis, which you haven't proven the United States government can affect by just putting aid. Just because we give aid to a country doesn't mean that we can actually reform their country.
So you never responded to the fact that 54 million lives have been saved so far, correct?
No.
So what you're saying is it was successful and now it won't lead to these new problems that are coming up?
No. What I'm saying is that it has been successful in the past, but your burden is to prove that you can reduce deaths by 90% and that you can solve active cases by 80%. You brought this up in your case, and you haven't been able to prove that will happen.
Okay, now you asked for a provable effect and some quantification, correct?
Sorry. I don't understand your question.
Now, about abandoning treatment resistance, you asked for a quantification, essentially was majority of your rhetoric throughout your speech?
My argumentation was that you haven't been able to show that these World Health Organization recommendations will work, and that I gave you the evidence why they won't work.
Okay, no more questions.
We completely agree with the affirmative burden of proof. We as the affirmative team need to prove 2 things. First, that a problem exists. Second, that we have a viable solution. So far, we've proven with quantification that this is true. However, in the last speech, they refuted our solvency points, talking about how we're going to save 10 million lives by arguing that the plan we're implementing, the World Health Organization plan, is ineffective. Now, first I'm going to respond to all of his solvency points, talking about how his arguments against the WHO plan don't actually hold up, and then finally I'll talk about how the World Health Organization plan is actually credible. But let's first take a look at the solvency point number 1, where he talked about the wrong approach. And he talked about the BCG vaccine and said it was unsuccessful, and read evidence saying it was not the most promising vaccine strategy. My first response you can write down as WHO is aware. WHO is aware. Now, the fact of the matter is the World Health Organization is aware that the BCG vaccine is not the most effective. That's why it has 2 aspects to its plan. One is prevention. One is actually giving current treatments to people. The second is research and development. They're doing research and development solely because some of the current treatment methods aren't actually effective. This is actually a turn because it shows that we should be voting affirmative. We're the only team in this round that funds research and development. So if you truly agree with his argument that the BCG vaccine is ineffective, you should be voting affirmative because we actually do research and development. But the second response you can write down as old evidence. Old evidence. The problem with his evidence is it's from 2009, and it says that there was unsuccessful implementation of the BCG vaccine. It doesn't quantify to what extent this was unsuccessful. All it says is that it's unsuccessful qualification, and it's from 2009. On top of that, it says it's not the most promising vaccine strategy. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work at all and that it has no purpose. My next response you can write down as is useful. Once again, is useful. How do we know that we have a vaccine that actually works? Because in the United States and many developed countries who can actually afford these vaccines and treatments, they've already eradicated TB. The United States doesn't have tuberculosis. Countries in Europe don't either, because this disease is classified as a curable disease, which means we do have some of the resources necessary to actually tackle it and reduce it. On top of that, in our background point, we read evidence saying that the USAID TB program has saved 54 million lives and reduced mortality by 50%. That means the current mechanisms we have do work. Yes, maybe they're not the most promising, but all that proves is that we should be funding research and development, which is exactly what we do. With that, let's take a look at solvency point number 2, where he talked about how the disease is not eradicable, and then he read his same evidence about the vaccine in 2009. Again, this evidence was from 2009. Well, my first response you can write down is old. My second you can write down as R&D already working. R&D already working. Now, his argument under this point was that we don't have a vaccine, the vaccine isn't really effective. And then he went on to say that it's all predicated on research and development. And there's no guarantee that research and development will actually give us a new vaccine or a new drug. Well, according to DevX in 2019, they've already seen success in implementing the World Health Organization plan. They say, as well as funding research and development to move to a purely oral treatment regimen in concordance with the latest World Health Organization guidelines. So they talk about how people fail to comply many times with their drug regimens because of how many side effects there were, which is something Luke talked about. They said about 2 years after the introduction of new TB drugs and treatment methods, the rates of patients who discontinue treatment has decreased from 25% to just 7%. So with 2 years of research and development, we've already been able to increase compliance and make a drug regimen that has fewer side effects and is much more easier to take. This compares to his old evidence, which was from 2009. My evidence was from 2019. But then in subpoint B, he talked about unknown cases, and he said many times we're not monitoring people with this problem. My response you can write down is we solved. We solved. Here's the thing, the World Health Organization plan, what it does is it invests in local health systems. So we tell countries, if you want to develop a clinic, we'll fund it. We'll invest in your local health system. You need to do these things. We are literally incentivizing them to change their policies to create an infrastructure that actually works. The reason they don't monitor right now, the reasons their policies don't do that right now, is because many of these countries are too poor to actually afford the infrastructure for data monitoring. But at the point at which we invest in their systems, we incentivize them to actually act. Now, the evidence to back this up, my logic up, is that we said in our justification point 1 how only 20% of people have treatment, which means only 1 in 5 people are actually detected right now and treated. But later on in our subpoint C in justification 2, we said 90% of people will be treated and detected if the funding is given, if we invest in local health systems. This study shows us how we can actually achieve it by investing in it. But my final response, even if you ignore my first two, you can write down as non-unique. Non-unique. Monitoring in many poor countries has always been bad. Their policies haven't always emphasized it. But in the past, we had the same challenges that didn't stop us from fighting Ebola or smallpox globally. We still did it. Just because there are some challenges to fighting a disease doesn't mean we should do nothing. This argument is not a reason to stay with the status quo. It's not a reason to avoid our plan. It's just a small challenge or a hitch in the road. Let's take a look at their next argument, which is the solvency, talking about inaccurate research and development and how research is probably going to be ineffective. My response you can write down is already turning up results. Look at the evidence I talked about. We're already turning up results with just 2 years of research and development. We went from people failing treatments 25% of the time to just 7%. But here's more evidence from 2019 talking about this. DevX said in 2019 that for drug resistance, because of research and development, we've already increased our success. They said for MDR TB patients or multi-drug resistant TB patients, the success rate has gone from 53% to 80%. And for XDR TB patients, it's gone from a mere 11% to 88%. So with just 2 years of research, with the current amount of funding we have, we've already achieved these results. Imagine how much more we could do with the remaining $1.3 billion in research and development. He basically just speculated here that maybe the research won't turn up anything, but the fact of the matter is research is already turning up results, which shows us that things are actually happening. But his final argument was the solvency, talking about drug resistance, saying we haven't given a new drug that actually solves for drug resistance. My response you can write down as supports us. I'm going to turn this argument to, because we are the only team that fund research and development, and that's the only way to fight drug resistance. But my second response you can write down is already have results. Not only are we the only team that fund research and development, we've actually just proven to you that this research and development is very promising and has already increased success rate from 50% to 80% for drug resistance, and for XDR drug resistance from 11% to 88%. With that, an observation before I end up the speech. Actually, before I do that, he responded to our solvency saying no proven effect and said that the recommendations are flawed because of these solvencies. I already refuted these solvencies, so I defended the plan. But my second response you can write down is credible plan. There are 2 reasons to believe that this plan is credible. The first, our subpoint A, is that 194 countries, including the United States, supported it. This was the World Health Assembly. They adopted this plan, 194 supported it. But subpoint B you can write down as past success. According to the USAID, in 2019, we already read this evidence. Since 2000, the USAID TB program with our partners, including the World Health Organization, have saved more than 54 million lives. Similar plans like this from the World Health Organization have saved many lives. Let's take a look at an observation to close off this speech, which you can write down as the cost of inaction. If we don't act now, more people are going to get this disease, the world economy will lose $1 trillion, and then we'll just have to deal with it 10 years from now when it'll cost us a lot more. The burden of the negative team is to prove why we should stay with the status quo and why we should wait till later before we actually act. Thanks so much for your time.
It's an excellent speech. Just have a couple of questions for you. First, you talked about the United States vaccine. Are the United States vaccine and the BCG vaccine the same?
Yeah, the World Health Organization is using the same vaccines we have in the United States because they're very cheap.
All right, so if our evidence says that the BCG vaccine has had limited success in implementation, how is it eradicating it in the United States? What's the difference?
That's the question my partner asked you in cross-ex. It's your job to reconcile that because this is your argument.
Okay, do you have evidence that the BCG is the same vaccine used in the United States?
No, we don't, but we're using the same treatment because it costs the same amount.
Okay. Next, you talked a little bit about oral treatments. You would agree with me that oral treatments are not vaccines?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Next, you talked a little bit about tuberculosis aid to different countries and how through the aid we can get those countries to reform. So is TB aid then conditional?
TB aid is not conditional. What we're telling countries, however, is that if you want, we are investing in their local health systems and helping them actually build up monitoring. So we're incentivizing them to actually do this. The reason monitoring doesn't exist right now is because many countries can't afford it. If we're giving them the funding, then we solve the problem there.
Okay, does the World Health Organization, the specific reason why monitoring doesn't exist is because funding doesn't exist?
I didn't read evidence to that effect, but I did read evidence to the effect that right now only 20% of people are actually detected. With our plan, 90% would be detected.
Okay, I guess the next question I have for you, I have a couple of questions about this big thing. So my first question for you is, to the best of your knowledge, where in here does it say that the United States should fill this funding gap?
It doesn't say that. So basically what the plan is it's a global plan adopted by 194 countries. It doesn't have country-specific sections. So it doesn't say France does this, England does this, the United States does this. All it says is this is what needs to happen. It doesn't matter who does it.
Okay, how many countries are in the world?
There's 194 member states in the World Health Organization.
Okay, well, more specifically, how many countries are affected by tuberculosis in the world?
I'm not sure exactly, but there's 30 high TB burden countries.
All right, and the United States affects, I believe, 50 countries with tuberculosis?
With our current funding of $260 million. Yes.
Okay, so under this plan, my understanding is that the Affirmative team wants the United States to provide a funding gap to the United States programs that affect 50 countries when there are potentially more countries affected by TB.
No, so right now we work in 50 countries because we only have $260 million. We are giving $4.8 billion and allowing the United States to continue to follow World Health Organization recommendations.
Okay, where in this
and they recommend to work in all the countries with the disease.
All right, so where exactly in this report does it recommend that the United States expand how many countries it works in, and if so, what countries?
Again, there's no country-specific actions. It says here's what needs to happen, and then individual countries will do what they can. Currently, the rest of the world has already given $7 billion. We can close the rest of the funding gap by giving the remaining $5 billion.
All right, thank you for your time.
All right. Let me start by saying I'm not going to read all of this in this speech. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. After reading the summary and after skimming through the very back section where it talks about recommendations and so on, what they said is true. Nowhere in it here does it say that the United States needs to close this funding gap. Furthermore, nowhere in here does it specify exactly which nations need to do what. It proposes a very generic number on how we're supposed to solve tuberculosis. My goal in this speech is to show you a few things. One, why the WHO shouldn't be taken as an absolute divine gospel truth on this message. Then secondly, we're going to look at, even if you kind of do accept that, the United States can't be the world's medicine man. And that's my first observation. The United States world savior, question mark. The United States world savior, question mark. Now I know, we would all love to keep this high opinion of ourselves that we're going to basically cure the entire world of tuberculosis by funding unknown programs, basically. But the problem is the WHO has basically given us a generic statistic on how much funding needs to be closed. But if there's no course of action for countries to actually follow, then what are we doing? Essentially, the affirmative team would like you to believe that money is magical and it's like goodwill points. If we put enough goodwill points into a problem, then it will resolve itself. But they have a large burden here. We aren't just talking about fixing a disease in a certain country. We're talking about eradicating tuberculosis from the entire world. And the WHO claims they know how to do this, and furthermore, the affirmative team believes that the United States is capable of doing it. So let's examine this. The first disadvantage you can write down, though, is more funding, no change. More funding, no change. Now, it's not that the fight against tuberculosis doesn't have money right now. They're getting billions of dollars yearly. That's in the evidence that they read in the 1AC. The problem is that they're not getting more money in the future, and somehow that has stalled out the efforts that are already going on. Well, I think there's actually a better reason for why efforts may have stalled. This evidence is from, this is probably an Indian name, you can tell me later actually, Sakaran Savarma. Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. She works for the Journal of Clinical Research and Bioethics, February 28th of 2017. I assume it's a she. Again, you can tell me later. Now, it says here that a large number of scientists have put in a lot of efforts, carry out research, and a huge amount of funds have been spent. This is in regards to tuberculosis. But most of these have been wasted because the findings were not utilized. In other words, we do research currently. We have new findings, and we just don't do anything with them. So how is more research actually going to fix this problem? The WHO said, yes, more research, more funding, this will like cure tuberculosis, but they haven't actually detailed that. You may think we're being a little bit nitpicky, but the fact of the matter is here, the affirmative team has assumed a huge burden in solving tuberculosis. So I present to you the second disadvantage, which is absolve others. Absolve others. Now, if you actually look, I found this nice page in the study here. Of the countries that are most affected by tuberculosis, there's a whole list of them. These are the top ones affected by tuberculosis. Angola, Bangladesh, Brazil, Cambodia, Central African Republic, China, Mozambique, Myanmar. They've all got the percentages here. One of the largest ones, however, is India. India, at this rate, should be considered a world power. They have a lot of resources. They're cutting edge in science. And yet, India is not doing their fair share to fix tuberculosis in their own country. Why is the United States paying to fix tuberculosis in India when India is just as capable as doing it as we are? Listen, it's great to want to save lives and fix problems, but if we do that for everyone else, sure, maybe more people live, but the world is a more bitter place. Countries need to assume their own responsibilities, and they can't get up in the next speech and say that India, of all countries, can't afford to fight tuberculosis in its own nation. Now, I've got a bunch of solvency arguments here to add to my partner's solvency because I thought we hadn't heard enough about solvency in this round. So the next solvency argument of the negative team you can write down as covered countries, question mark. Covered countries, question mark. Now, they said in their speech that the United States operates in 50 countries. However, there are literally hundreds of countries in the lists back here that talk about how much funding all of them need and what all that work is going to be and so on. Now, here's my question. They never brought up evidence that the increase in United States funding would mean that we'd be able to expand our operation in those countries. We know that generically, the WHO said this amount of money will work theoretically, but different countries have different ways of fighting tuberculosis. They have different programs, different wages, different hours, and so on. So they didn't provide evidence that United States programs would work in these countries with that amount of funding. It may be more, it may be less, we don't know. They need to provide those numbers. Now, the next solvency point you can write down as the plan doesn't link. The plan doesn't link. What do I mean by this? I mean that, first of all, there's nowhere in here that says paying this funding gap from the United States will actually solve tuberculosis. The WHO has this long, lengthy article here, but really, the question isn't solved at the end. And furthermore, a lot of their findings should not be taken at face value. This is from Tom Blackwell of the National Post on February 1st of 2015. He says, in the confusing and fast-changing world of medicine, few voices carry as much weight as that of the World Health Organization. But a new Canadian-led analysis takes a poke at that reputation, concluding that the UN agency often makes strong recommendations on how to treat or prevent illnesses based on weak evidence, potentially leading to patients getting less than optimal care. The study concluded that 73 of 289 strong recommendations the agency issued on topics ranging from maternal health to tuberculosis were based on low-quality evidence and warranted only conditional advice. You know, the WHO's got this very high opinion of itself, and the fact of the matter is they can't just say, pay this much money and the problem will be solved. Now, as long as we're talking about the no, that's right. The next solvency point you can write down is the WHO not reliable. WHO not reliable. Here's the thing, the WHO actually wastes funds itself. According to Maria Chang of the Associated Press on May 27th of 2017, it says that at a time when the cash-strapped health agency is pleading for more funding to fund its responses to health crises worldwide, it has struggled to get its own travel costs under control. Senior officials have complained internationally that UN staffers break new rules that were introduced to try and curb expansive traveling spending. Bookings, perks like business class on airplane tickets, etc., etc. Now later, Jim Stiper of the National Review reported on June 14th of 2017 that the AP obtained documents showing that the WHO routinely has spent about $200 million a year on travel expenses, more than it doles out to fight some of the biggest problems in public health, including AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. All right? So this study here, this was funded with less money than they spend on their transportation yearly. Ultimately, we can't just take this magic number for granted, and until they provide specific evidence that the United States paying that money will fix tuberculosis globally, you should vote for the negative team.
Just to be clear, you are arguing against the affirmative plan, correct?
I hope I am.
Let's take a look at your first argument, where you talked about how the United States is not the world's savior or should not be the world's savior.
Alright, if you're nice, but...
Right, and you would agree that a funding gap is different from the total amount of funding you need, right?
Could you clarify?
All right, so how much money does the NTB strategy require?
I don't actually know, that's your statistic.
All right, and you, okay, assuming that it is $13 billion, you would agree that the funding gap means that part of it is already funded, part of it isn't, right?
I'd agree that's what the WHO says.
All right, so assuming that other countries have already given $7 billion, the United States isn't really the world's savior by passing a fund, right?
Well, it's all those other countries taking up $7 billion, was that 196 countries, and then we're just supposed to take up like another quarter of that? I'm saying that
Right,
there are
but you
some
would agree
logical
we're not the
gaps in
only-
your, I'm saying there's some logical gaps in your train of thinking here, that all of these countries have been participating, and
so-
the United States just to come in, Hail Mary, and fix it all at the end.
I understand. So let's talk about the actual world economy, because we said if we don't act, the world economy will lose $1 trillion. You would agree that the United States is very interconnected in the world economy, right?
I would, but that
And you would
number
agree
also
that-
came from the WHO, right?
No, actually not.
Different number.
But yes, but let's talk about that. You would agree that the United States constantly is bailing out other countries or working with organizations like the International Monetary Fund to protect other countries in the world economy, right?
To a fault, yes.
And you would agree the reason they do that is because if the world economy loses money, it's gonna affect us too, right?
Well, generically, yes.
All right, let's take a look at your first disadvantage, where you said more money doesn't mean that we're going to have more change. And essentially you said many of the findings in research and development were not utilized. Did you respond to my 2 examples of actual research and development turning up results when it came to drug resistance and the new drug regimens?
Even you said the new drug stuff isn't being used despite the apparent abundance of money here. So, again, this would fall
But
and
did you
support my
respond to the
evidence.
success of research and development?
Well, this doesn't deny that they make new findings. I'd say that's a success.
All right,
It says
so
that they don't utilize
Let's
them.
talk about findings not being utilized. You
All
would
right.
agree that if a study turns up no actual useful results, that it shouldn't be utilized, right?
Sure.
And you would agree that not all studies create new drugs.
Not all studies create new drugs, yes.
All right, let's take a look at disadvantage point 2, where you talked about how we're absolving others, and then you basically attacked India for not doing enough. Did you read any evidence saying that India didn't actually?
No,
All
I
right,
didn't.
so what if India is part of the countries that already gave us $7 billion?
Well, I'm sure
Would that mean they're doing their job?
I'm sure they are giving money, but here's the thing. If they give even $1 billion, why should we give them $4 billion to fix their own problem?
Right, but you said that India wasn't doing anything despite being capable. You would agree that
I'm saying that because India is one of the largest, I'll answer your question, one of the largest countries with tuberculosis in the world, there's no reason that they as a first world country can't fix it themselves like we've done in the United States.
Sure. Let's start this negative rebuttal by giving you an observation point, which you can write down as the magic box. Again, the magic box. Now, this is going to be really important because it goes back to the idea of the affirmative team's burden. They have to prove to us with an evidential link that what's happening in the status quo can actually be solved by them. Now, this is where we get the magic box. You see, we have a problem over here. We have tuberculosis. It's not ideal. We're not arguing that tuberculosis is a good thing. Then they say that by funding this plan, we can somehow stop tuberculosis. However, there's a magic box between these two positions. They don't actually explain how we get there, other than the fact that the World Health Organization says that if you throw this much cash into the problem, we're going to get there. Now, it's a problem because, as they referenced within Cross-X, and we've kind of been talking about, the United States affects 50 countries that have tuberculosis. And while that seems like a good number, it's important to recognize that we're not funding a World Health Organization program. What we're instead doing is that we're throwing money at our programs that are linked under the requirements that the World Health Organization recommends. What does this mean? It's not like the world is putting together this collective tuberculosis fund that will be addressing tuberculosis, but instead it's talking about a bunch of countries just throwing cash at the problem. Now, that doesn't actually prove solvency. They need to give us specific evidence saying that by the United States increasing money and by increasing the money in our programs, we will actually see this effect. And until we do that, there's simply a magic box between the affirmative team's plans and their solvency. Additionally, I just want to remind you of the criterion that they agreed to, which is this idea of proven effect. Now, they're going to talk a lot about how tuberculosis kills people, about how it's going to cost the global economy a lot. It's going to sound very compelling. But what we're weighing this debate round on today is whether or not the World Health Organization recommendations will actually eradicate tuberculosis deaths by 90% and will actually affect new cases by 80%, not how significant of an issue tuberculosis is. Now, let's look on to their responses to my argumentation. In response to Solvency 1 of the wrong approach, they gave 4 responses of how the World Health Organization is aware, they got new methods, this was old evidence, and it is useful. I'm going to respond to all this by saying that BCG is a bad recommendation. Again, BCG is a bad recommendation. They haven't provided evidence that that's the type of vaccine that we use in the United States, and that's their burden. But in addition to the evidence saying that, it's also important that the evidence later on reference this idea of a need for a new vaccine. They can't say that BCG is good when the evidence explicitly states that if we really want to tackle tuberculosis, we need a new vaccine to eradicate it, and BCG hasn't been useful. They have to prove that this has actually been used in the United States, and until they do that, this evidence still stands. Let's now move on to this response of Solvency 2 of how this is not eradicable. Their first response of old evidence and their second response of are indeed working, you can tell my response here is still not a vaccine. Again, still not a vaccine. Now, why does this matter? This goes back to the evidence that I read under the solvency point 2 here of not eradicable by the fact that we need a new vaccine, and that without a new vaccine, we can't hope to eradicate tuberculosis. Next, their third response here is that new methods decreased to 7%. Now, this was specifically talking about the number of patients that were basically running away from the painful TB vaccines. Or, sorry, not vaccines, from the TB drug treatments. You can tell my response here as tastier drugs, question mark. Again, tastier drugs. This doesn't actually prove that the TB drugs are more effective, just that they hurt less when you take them, which is really not significant. Now, if we keep this in mind, let's now examine the second response. They talked about this idea of detection. For their first 2 responses were first that they solve, and the second of the evidence. They talked about this idea that the World Health Organization says that they can increase detection. Now, you can tell my response is no policy shift. Again, no policy shift. Again, I refer you back to their study from the World Health Organization. They said that in many countries, levels of underreporting may be high. This is especially the case for countries that lack policies on mandatory notification. Now, what is mandatory notification? It means that somebody knows this person has TB, but then just doesn't notify anybody about it, which no matter how much cash you throw at the problem is not going to be fixed. Next, let's move on. They said this was not unique. My response here is no detection equals no solvency. If they can't detect people, they can't cure them. Now, they said in response to the idea, they gave this idea that we're already getting results, and they said this in a couple of areas. You can tell my response as there's one of 2 things. The first response is that of no need. Again, no need. If somehow we're still curing people with what the affirmative team believes is a very limited amount of money in only 2 years, then why do we need to increase the plan if we're already doing so well? But the second response is the other part of the double blind, which is the weak links. They never proved a distinction between the problems given with mouse treatments and what the World Health Organization's technology is actually researching. Until they can say that the World Health Organization does not recommend using mice as a TB research subject, then they have no proof that new methods will actually be successful. Next, they talk about this idea of a credible plan and how 194 countries signed on to it. But my response here is that one funds it, question mark? This doesn't seem justified. And the second point under here was that of USAID. My response here is hindsight is 20/20 only. We've only seen success in previous methods. We haven't seen success in new methods. For this reason, their plan is not justified.
Let's start off at the top of the 2NC. We essentially gave a lot of rhetoric about how we're going to be the world savior, and we basically should be the world savior. Two responses to this. My first response is other countries also fund. Other countries also fund. This is from Advancing TB Vaccines for the World in 2017. It says 7 billion was available for domestic countries to use for TB prevention in 2016. They essentially give $7 billion a year already. We're not going to be the world savior. What we're doing is filling what these poorer countries can't pay. Remember, these are poorer countries. And if we can be the world savior, why not? If we can save 10 billion lives, well, because Nathan doesn't feel like being the world savior because it doesn't sound that great, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We can save 10 million lives and we have the capability, why not do it? Now, under here we had further rhetoric about how it's not, we don't know which methods we're funding. It wasn't tagged, but I'll respond to this by saying known methods. Again, known methods. He basically said the report was generic and vague. This wasn't a tagged argument, it was just his rhetoric, so I'm going to clarify this. The methods we're funding are the known methods. These known methods have saved 54 million lives. The WHO tells us exactly where to put the money. Say, here's the pool of money, and then they disperse it to certain NGOs. They'll say, well, when this country needs more, put this in research and development. It's those methods. It's all in the 270-page report. But the methods are known and they've been successful in the past. We know exactly where the spending is going. Disadvantage one was with more funding and no change. Basically, under here, he brought up a piece of evidence from this, maybe really couldn't pronounce, that said in 2017 that the research and development funding is being wasted. This doesn't apply. Here's why. One response, in the country of India. Again, in the country of India. This is actually from the Tuberculosis Control Center in India. So this is a small domestic NGO in India that does domestic research, and what this guy's complaining about is saying, well, this one organization in India didn't use money for its research and development correctly. This is not applicable to our plan. So that's my second response. Does not apply to our plan. Does not apply to our plan. This is talking only about in the country of India, one specific organization didn't use a certain amount of money correctly. It's not saying when you fund the WHO, they don't use it correctly. This is just specific to one country and one organization. My second response, our funding used correctly. Our funding used correctly. How do we see this? Well, there's no complaints with the WHO funding not being used. It saved 54 million lives. We've already developed an oral treatment. It's decreased drug resistance by almost 40 or 50%. Our research funding is being used correctly. Disadvantage two is absolving others. Now, basically under here, his rhetoric was, well, if we pass our plan, the world will become a more better place. I fail to see how saving 10 million lives makes the world a more better place. We're stopping a disease. That doesn't mean we make the world a more better place. He basically said absolve others means India shouldn't fund it. They should be funding more. Again, why do we have to do it? My response is other countries already fighting. Other countries already fighting. Let's keep in mind here, other countries have given 7 billion. India has domestic programs already. They're doing the best they can. If we see the funding gap, if we can fix the problem, we definitely should. Solvency point one was of which countries do we cover? My response is global plan. Again, global plan. Remember, the USAID works around the globe. We're trying to solve it around the globe. All of our evidence advocates and experts say if we fill the funding gap, we will treat the disease in every country. This is simply not a problem. We fix it in every single country that has tuberculosis. There are NGOs already working there. The funding just goes there. It's along the current spending patterns for the global plan. Now, my solvency, so their solvency point two was a plan doesn't link and the WHO is not trustworthy. Here's why the plan links. My response is fill the funding gap. Again, fill the funding gap. The link in every single piece of evidence is quite simple. If you fill the funding gap, we will save 10 million lives. If we fill the funding gap, this will happen. It doesn't say if the US specifically, it says if any country fills the funding gap. This is a pool of money that any country can put into. We're just putting money into the pool, and then it says when the pool is full, the lives will be saved. That's what's happening. It perfectly links up. You're talking about the WHO is not trustworthy. My response is report supported by 194 countries. Reports supported by 194 countries. And when the WHO gives out strong recommendations, those are urgent recommendations, saying we need funding in this month right now, and that's based on weak evidence because it's very recent. This is a plan. It's a complete comprehensive report over 15 years. This is, first of all, not the same as a strong recommendation. Second of all, experts from 194 countries, basically every country with TB that even has a health system, has looked over this report and found it to be credible. It's a perfectly credible report. Now, the next solvency point was that WHO is not reliable. Why? Because they have more travel costs or something like that. My response is not giving it to the WHO. not giving it to the WHO. We aren't funding the WHO. The WHO tells us where to put the money. So we're not funding the WHO's travel expenses. That's their internal problems. So because they have internal management problems, is not a reason to not listen to their plan and give it to the USAID. This is a completely external issue and doesn't apply. So we go into the 1 in R, he said we need to explain everything and how there's a magic box. My response is our programs are successful. What we've proven so far is all of our advocacy supports filling the funding gap. Filling the funding gap will solve the problem, and the current spending patterns have been successful. That's what we've proven so far. There is no magic box. Second response, anyone can fill the gap. Anyone can fill this funding gap, and it does result in the 10 million lives being saved and the disease being helped. You talk about BCG being bad, my response is have a successful treatment. So I can have a successful treatment. Under here, a lot of this argument said, well, we desperately need a vaccine. My response to this is needed vaccine in 2009. The 2009 evidence says we desperately needed a vaccine. But in 2019, 10 years later, every scientist has found the oral treatment we have now is far better. The BCG vaccine might be ineffective. We have new treatment methods, and funding for development fills all these problems. Thank you.
The last negative speech of the round, and as this will not TV continued, I plan on wrapping everything up here. There are 5 reasons you should vote for the negative team, but before I get to that, let me present you with this analogy, all right? Let's say there's a room of people and they take a poll of those people. And they find that 3 people like chocolate ice cream, and then 4 people like vanilla ice cream. 1 person likes strawberry ice cream. And so the consensus of the report is not, well, this percentage of people like this ice cream, this percentage of people like this ice cream, no, the consensus of the report is that this many people like ice cream. That's the problem with this WHO report. It's basically saying, yes, there's this generic number that we can just fill, and suddenly all of these problems will be solved. But it doesn't take into account the minutia of what actually needs to happen. In fact, their entire case is predicated on other countries working with each other, and yet they propose that one country fix the entire problem. The first reason to vote for the negative team is the burden. The burden. Now, we didn't give this burden to them, they assumed it themselves. And in fact, Southweek, to his credit, even said that yes, this is our burden at the beginning of the round, that they need to solve tuberculosis. And they believe they can do this by following exactly what the WHO says. So if you have any doubt at the end of the round that by passing their plan in 10 years, tuberculosis will still exist, then you should vote for the negative team. The second reason to vote for the negative team is different ice cream. Different ice cream. This is specifically with regard to the WHO report here. First of all, the WHO has proposed this magic number. Now, this is, for one thing, far too generic, and then for another, the WHO relies on global interoperability. Even they said that the United States needs to get permission or a request from another country to start working there. So there's no solvency on this front because we're requiring to work with other countries. But furthermore, the successes they stated so far haven't been because one country decided to fund all of these projects. It's because individual countries spent the amount they needed in their own nation to fix the problem. Throughout this round, they said all these different countries are helping, and that was correlated directly with lots of success. Why? Because tuberculosis spans past political boundaries. And when all of those people inside the political boundaries are working to fix them inside them, that works. They've not shown evidence that the United States basically throwing money at the world is going to fix this problem. Now, the next thing here is that the study nowhere says that the funding gap could be filled by the United States. Nowhere does it say that. They're going to come up here and say we just need to pay the money and it will work. But that just leaves out a whole bunch of other problems. The third reason to vote for the negative team is inherency. Inherency. They're in a little bit of a double bind here. On the one hand, they say, we got all of these great methods that were just created. And even before those great methods were created, we've solved like 50 million deaths and we're doing all these great advances in tuberculosis. And yet somehow they believe that we're not going to be saving people in the future because we don't pay the amount that the WHO wants us to. Obviously, what's happening in the status quo is already fixing the problem. Their own evidence says so. And the only word that we have to go on here is the WHO saying that we don't have enough money. Well, the WHO spends more money on first-class airplane tickets than it did to write that study. So why should we take their word for this? Now, this is the double bind because let's say that none of that is true, in which case they have no solvency because those new drugs and those new testing things that they said were so great aren't actually working. They have to choose. The fourth reason to vote for the negative team is the WHO is not reliable. WHO is not reliable. Now, they basically said that our evidence from the Canadians, and who doesn't trust Canadians, was not specific to studies. It said strong recommendations, but that's all this study is. That's what they've been saying this is. They've been saying that this study tells the world this is what we need to do to fix the problem. I would call that a strong recommendation. Furthermore, it specifies tuberculosis on topics ranging from maternal health to tuberculosis were based on low quality evidence and warranted only conditional advice. In other words, that study, we have no idea if the number that they got from that study can actually be held as fact because they don't always rely on good statistics. Now, the last reason to vote for the negative team is solvency. Solvency. This is pretty simple. They dropped the argument that my partner brought up in his speech about detection. And basically, countries don't report when they find tuberculosis. We can't solve that because we aren't those countries paying for those problems. Furthermore, they didn't prove that their new methods work because they dropped my partner's analysis on how the rat models don't match those of the WHO. So we don't actually know if these new vaccines work or exist. Because they have failed their burden, we strongly urge that you vote for the negative team.
The negative team, which they themselves agreed to in cross-ex, is to prove that we should stay with the status quo, that we should avoid the affirmative plan. So let's analyze every single one of their arguments and see if they actually impact out to staying with the status quo, if they actually prove that you should vote against our plan. Two voting issues. The first voting issue you can write down is a problem exists. Once again, the two things you need to prove is that a problem exists and a viable solution. Let's first talk about problem existing. They tell you that tuberculosis is the leading cause of death, despite the fact that it's curable. All they say in response to this point is that there's this principle, philosophically, that the United States should not be the world's savior, that we shouldn't absolve others of their actual tasks. 2 points under this in response to this argument. The first you can write down as not absolving. Not absolving. We're not absolving other countries of their responsibility because, as my partner pointed out, other countries already gave $7 billion. The United States is only filling the rest of the gap, which is $5 billion. And the reason we do this, the reason we can do this, is because we're the largest foreign aid donor. With other countries, they've made up $7 billion. India has done their part. Many countries have given as much as they can. We're not absolving them, we're just helping them so that they can close the rest of the funding gap. But the subpoint B, or the second point you can write down as a response, we benefit. We benefit. Here's how we need to decide whether or not we pass a policy, whether we benefit or not. When we close the funding gap, the world economy gets a $1.2 trillion return on investment, which means we as the United States get hundreds of billions of dollars. So it doesn't matter this philosophy they tell you, because practically we benefit, we should act. Voting issue number 2 is viable solution. They talk about how the World Health Organization plan is flawed because it calls for throwing cash at a problem and not actually doing anything. Those 240 pages don't just say throw cash at a problem 9 million times. They actually say where the cash goes. It's very simple. When you spend $3.5 billion, you buy vaccines. You give it to people who can't afford it. You invest in local health clinics. So throwing money at a problem does actually solve it, even though it sounds nice to say that it doesn't. But subpoint A under this you can write down as 194 countries. 194 countries actually supported this, including our own government. What does this prove? That we have experts backing us up. Subpoint B you can write down and save 54 million lives. We saved 54 million lives in the past following World Health Organization recommendations. This is empirics. So I've shown you first we have experts and advocates. Second, that we have empirics backing us up. But third, let's actually take a look at the problems they pointed out. So subpoint C you can write down as solvency problems. They had many solvency arguments where they basically picked apart a report and said, here's a problem with it, here's a reason why it's not reliable. Their first thing was talking about the BCG vaccine, saying this is a bad recommendation. I have 2 responses. My first you can write down as only vaccine. In the United States, we give the BCG vaccine as well. In fact, the own study says the main healthcare interventions to prevent new infections are the BCG vaccine. So they have the BCG vaccine and treatment of people with latent TB. That's what we use in the United States. That's what has been successful. So yes, it is successful. But even if you don't believe that, the second you can write down as improving. Improving. Our plan actually funds research and development. Later on in the same report, it says development pipelines are progressing, and then it says that that TB funding for TB research and development has increased, and there are currently several treatment regimens and 12 vaccine candidates in clinical trials being funded by the World Health Organization. So we're already funding new vaccines, not just new drugs, also new vaccines. They're also trying to develop a new vaccine. Priorities include a vaccine to lower the risk of infection, a vaccine or new drug treatment to cut the risk of TB disease. So yes, the BCG vaccine is not perfect, So we're trying to develop a better vaccine. Again, this supports us. Then they talk about unknown cases and say people don't always notify when they actually have the disease. My response, you can write it down, is 90%. Our plan invests in local healthcare systems and help them build the infrastructure for monitoring. Our own evidence says 90% of TB patients will be detected and provided treatment, because why? We invest in local health systems and help this actually happen. Next, they talk about drug resistance. Again, it doesn't matter whether you're using mice or not. The fact of the matter is we actually turned up results. I read evidence for this. Our success went from 50% to 88% because of the research we did. So research findings are being utilized. They are working. Finally, he talked about travel costs. My response to that is not a dime goes to the World Health Organization. So this is pretty much irrelevant. And also on top of that, reports are not that expensive to make. They were, sure, it costs the same amount as the travel costs. Next, he talked about how their strong recommendations were based on low quality evidence. My response, you can write it down, as challenges exist. This is a non-unique problem because in poor countries, there's very little evidence of what is actually happening, as they themselves argue. So the World Health Organization has to work with what they have. This is a challenge, but it didn't stop us from fighting Ebola or smallpox. It shouldn't stop us from fighting tuberculosis either. Thanks so much for your attention.